Welcome, welcome, welcome. So it's that time to get into the future and to understand what is actually happening. So I'm super, super excited to be inviting and to have Clem Sunter to be able to talk about the latest global scenarios and also the local ones for the world economy. You know, it's really interesting because we live in really interesting times. And, you know, when you consider we've had the Ukraine in the last 2 years, the Ukraine conflict, we had inflation at all-time highs. We've had interest rates rising. We've had fuel prices rising. We had the stock market up and down, load shedding in South Africa, the Israeli conflict, the assassination attempt of Trump, the Labour winning by record margins in England, the GNU in South Africa, Biden quitting the race, Trump's landslide, you know, all the current tariffs and everything, America first, and then, you know, more recently, the land policy that's going on. And I remember when I was talking to Clem at the end of last year, and I said, hey, what about if we do a presentation on the scenarios and where the world is going at the beginning or sort of end of January? And he said, Scott, Donald Trump gets into power on the 20th of January. We need to give him 6 weeks to just kind of see what's happening and where he's going to go. And my word, I certainly didn't expect everything that's happened in those 6 weeks. So the question I have for all of you that I would be asking myself while Clem is sharing with you his insights, his scenarios, his probabilities, and his flags, is how do you actually protect your wealth? When one considers everything that's going on around the world, all the uncertainty, all the lack of understanding, et cetera, what do you actually do to protect your wealth? And so this is what this presentation is all about. It's to get insight and to get understanding. And I'm very, very grateful that once Clem has given us the scenarios and the probabilities and the flags, he's also going to give us the opportunity to ask him questions. So if you want to just go to the link, you can scan it, and or you can go to the link, askclemsunter.com/questions. And what that'll do is it'll take you through to this group here. So this is our Wealth University. It's a free group. And you can literally go in here and you can actually ask questions. So you can see the PDF with the last flags, scenarios, and probabilities. And you can literally go through and you can see all the different questions that people have already asked. So some of them have been asking questions already in terms of that process. So that's the better place to ask questions than in the chat box in terms of, because then obviously we can use it. Tonight, no one is providing financial advice. We are trying to get insights, to get understanding, but there's no financial advice that's been given. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that many, many years ago, I remember seeing Clem. I'd watched him for about 5 years. And I remember learning each time, every year, I watched him present on the different scenarios around the world, the different flags and the different probabilities. And I remember thinking to myself, well, it's really, really useful if you actually take all the information that he's teaching, but you actually have to have a model or a framework to be able to make decisions. And so I built a model to take into account, and this was when, you know, I was mainly doing residential property investing, and I took into account the main fundamentals of investing. And then it allowed us to make better decisions in terms of which countries to invest in and where to invest. And we called it the global property system. And, you know, one of the things I've found fascinating over the years is following Clem and trying to understand what is happening with the different scenarios. I mean, most of you will remember the book, The Mind of the Fox. And I was very, very grateful, you know, in 2013, when Clem actually wrote the foreword for the book, Property Going Global. And it was really based on these models and trying to understand where to invest in the world and what to do. We've upgraded that in the last 10 years. In the last year or so, we upgraded it to Wealth Going Global. And what this basically does is it helps people know the top 5 countries to invest, the top 5 currencies, the top 15 assets, how to find the right partners and avoid the mistakes that 80% of people make, and how to build a plan over time. It's ultimately about diversifying and building diversified passive income. It's about diversifying across countries, currencies, assets, partners, and time. And I wanted to share with you a quick little video because this gentleman is a wealthy South African, and he had his wealth in South Africa, and he was looking to diversify around the world. And he's one of the people that took the understanding and actually took action in terms of implementing it. So I wanted to share this short little video with you, which I think will be of tremendous value in terms of this process. Sorry, just give me 2 seconds. I just need to get the video, share my video file with you. And Here it is, yeah.
And I'm a living example of that. In my little life journey from opening up my own auditing practice, the firm today audits the Auditor General of South Africa in terms of doing, pre-issuance reviews, etc.
So Abdul, let me ask a question to you in terms of it. So you've been very, very successful in property in your country, but you went and decided to sign up.
Scott, like I said to you at the beginning, I have this wealth. It's all localized. I have no exposure anywhere else on earth. Okay, so the catchy phrase from your side was going global, or diversified income going global. Now that appealed to me. In other words, yes, I may be rich in this country. What happens if I'm outside? There's all types of restrictions in terms of the transfer of my wealth, my assets, wherever I may be on earth. So that appealed to me, and that really opened an opportunity or a process for me in terms of engaging in diversifying my wealth. And I must say, although I have the brains to think that out, why must I do that? Yeah, you're giving it to us on a platter. So we follow that process, and yes, we engage, and yes, we will get exposed. We have obviously since did do an investment again in property. Property is the economics, I understand. Now, one of the things you alerted us or reminded myself is that if you do things in teams, it becomes easier. Collective wisdom is better than your own limited and parochial type of ideas. So that's also something I quite enjoyed. But if you don't have that, maybe we'll never get to success.
Yeah.
Surely it won't happen next week, but as long as it happens, I think you're on the right road. And that's the path I've chosen to take. And thanks to you, Scott. And it's never too late. The only time when you're late is when you're late. You're dead.
Yeah.
Up until then, you have a purpose on this earth, perform it.
So I hope you enjoyed that. Abdul is an amazing gentleman based out of Cape Town and actually audits the Auditor General in South Africa, which is pretty amazing. And I always say that when one's investing and when one's taking into account all the information that you're about to get, there's two things that are important. You need the right information and you need the right partners. And so I built a gift for you. And effectively, it's a training that, for me, just like I did when you're listening now, and I strongly recommend that you're going to take a lot of notes, sit down everything that Clem says on the scenarios, the flags, the probabilities. But what do you do beyond the scenarios and the flags? How do you actually implement it? And so I've shared with you a training where you can literally go and get it. It's for free. And it's the 4D Wealth Blueprint training. So it'll literally help you take the information to be able to make smart decisions for yourself and ultimately to build diversified passive income. So you can literally go to the link, askclemsunter.com/4D. And I've got some good news for you. We're about to embark on our Wealth Weekend. It literally starts tomorrow at 4 o'clock. It's a 2.5-day event. It's a live event with our mastermind members. And to those people that sign up for this training, you're actually going to get a virtual invite to the Wealth Weekend. So that's with our family office. The family office look after the top 1% of the world. They look after the wealthiest of the wealthy. And they're going to be teaching people and taking diversification to the next level. How do you diversify? What are some of the wealth strategies? So literally come and learn from the best. And if you sign up to this, it's free, then you'll get access to that. And so we'll send you a link and you will literally get access to it in terms of that process. And finally, I'll talk more about this later, but if you do want to book a call with one of the team, it's a no obligation, literally free one-to-one. You can sit down, you can understand with the team how to build diversified passive income as soon as possible. You literally book it for free with our team. It doesn't cost you anything, and we also don't sell you anything. So the whole idea is to understand where you're at and to try and provide you with some direction. And so I want to leave you with one last video, and then we're going to pivot to Clem. And this was a gentleman also that wanted to diversify. And, you know, the challenges of diversifying can be large. And this was his experience in terms of the process. He had a whole bunch of investments with different financial planners, and it was so nice. And this was his feedback on consolidating and being able to diversify with peace of mind.
No, definitely, Scott. I mean, it is so stressful not to know where to go. To have financial partners and advice. I mean, just the connections that you gave us, bring us in contact with these people to understand it. It makes a world of a difference. It takes a lot of stress off your shoulders, weight. It's actually a very positive experience, especially in the world now with all these uncertainties. But from a human side, I mean, this was a phenomenal experience. And it happened so fast for us. But we were ready for it. I feel that we have proper partners in you and in the mastermind and with Calio. It's a very positive experience.
So without further ado, it's time for me to share and to welcome Clem to the stage. I'm the virtual stage, whatever you want to call it. But Clem, as always, I've been deeply privileged and very, very grateful for the insight, the wisdom that you've shared over the years. And, you know, I don't know exactly how long it's been from my side. I know my father used to talk about you when we were talking in the low road and the high road. So it's been a long, long journey of me following all your different scenarios. But it's with a huge amount of humility and gratitude that you're joining us here tonight. You know, we live in these tumultuous times. And I must admit, of all the years and all the presentations you and I have done, this is probably the one I'm looking forward to most, because I need the insights into what you think with Trump and tariffs and America first and land policies. But without further ado, I'll shut up and hand over to you.
Thanks, Scott, very much. And, it's always an absolute privilege and pleasure to talk at one of your webinars. I want to start by just going over an issue which I discussed with some Stellenbosch students last week. I was asked to lecture at Stellenbosch University to a lot of students who are studying the future there. And one of the things that really got to them, which I haven't really stressed in many of my past lectures, is that you don't really get a real feel for the future by yourself. You have to actually discuss it with your friends. And that phrase, collective wisdom, which was used by the speaker in the first video, is absolutely spot on. Because I said to them, the best thing you can do after my lecture is to actually get a group of your friends, sit around the table, and actually discuss the results of this lecture. And it should be a round table. And then I thought to myself, you know, it's not just students who should be doing this, it's actually companies. Because often when I used to do facilitation workshops at companies on their future, they would be sitting at a long table with the CEO in a throne at one end. And you know, when we had a discussion, it really was on things that were useful for the company in terms of the plan they already had. You know, because the CEO often just wouldn't want to hear inconvenient truths. And actually, you've got to blast through that kind of barrier and actually have people around with equal status at the table. And they should be allowed to speak, because often it is the guy who is down the line but has some very original ideas that gives you a real feel. And when I go through the global flags, I'm going to talk about some of the guys who gave them to me. I didn't think these flags up. They were given to me during the course of my career as a futurist at Anglo American. And, you know, I feel this is such an important point now, because the future, as Scott was saying, is so uncertain that you've got to actually sit round a table and discuss it with your friends before you make any decisions. In the book which Scott showed you, which is Thinking the Future, I'd like to just mention some of the philosophers who, you know, are absolutely critical to the kind of futuristic way you should consider when you look at the future. Firstly, there's the contrast between Plato and Aristotle, because Plato actually was one of those philosophers who said, you just have to sit under a tree in the shade of a tree, stroke your chin, and think about the future and the most ideal form for the world, and then you'll have the truth. And in fact, there's a famous painting of Plato and Aristotle walking through some old building with Plato pointing his finger upwards. And that was his approach. Whereas Aristotle said, it's nothing to do with that. Obviously, you've got to have a smart mind, but you've got to look around you and you've got to consider all the evidence coming in. And you've got to consider it all the time, because that's how you build up a feel for the world and where it's going. And you can never be absolutely right. You can always improve your thinking about the future. And that contrast between Plato and Aristotle is what I call the contrast between a hedgehog and a fox. Because there was another Greek philosopher called Archilochus who said, and he was born before Plato and Aristotle, he said the hedgehog knows one big thing and the fox knows many little things. And I just thought that was a wonderful way of contrasting Plato with Aristotle, and also with people who say you should have just one strategic plan, one forecast of the future, and drive the company forward along the path of the plan. And that's very much a hedgehog approach. Whereas a fox will have a plan, absolutely, but then we'll be looking at all the different forces and new things happening around the world and adapt the plan and change strategy and tactics. And, I feel certainly from the point of view of running a company and also in how you handle your investments, the latter strategy is the one that you must follow. Yes, you've got to be diversified, because often something happens which is completely off the wall. And in a diversified asset, country, currency situation, you'll probably have less damage done to your portfolio than you would if you had actually singled out a particular investment or currency. But you must also have this kind of thinking of sitting around the table, and maybe with Scott and some of his managers, in terms of, getting a better feel yourself for how the future can change. Which brings me to Socrates. Socrates was a great philosopher too, because he said, and we quote it in this book, Thinking the Future, he said, I know nothing, but what I can do is ask the right questions. And often the key to opening the door on the future is to ask the right questions when you're sitting around the table, because that way you then start seeing some different light on the other side and moving forward in your thinking of the future. So, those were the sort of my opening remarks, but I want to just go through the methodology that I put in this book, which was written in 2015. And when I actually come to the flags that I'm going to talk about, a lot of these flags are in this book, which was written in early 2015, called Flag Watching. And I'm very proud of the fact that America's top scenario planner, a guy called Thomas Chermak, who's at the Colorado State University and actually has formed a school of scenario planning there, gave it a 5-star rating on Amazon and also said outstanding. So I can't do better than have one of America's top futurists saying that this book is outstanding. And it essentially outlines the following specific way you look at the future before you get on to what Scott was talking about, then considering the implications and then making the decisions about your portfolio. The first thing you have to do is identify the flags that are driving forces which basically drive the present into the future. And you will see that some of my flags are very long-term flags. So it's not about sort of changing them every day. It's about selecting a particular flag, and then obviously you can then have sub-flags flowing out of that flag, which may make you change your mind a bit about the flag. There are two types of flags. There's the clockwork flags that tick away like trends, and one of them I'll be talking about is the grey flag of the aging of the many parts of the world's population and what it can do. But then obviously you can have a cloudy flag like the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel, where you can paint a whole different bunch of scenarios flowing out of the flag. So the first part of the specific process of looking at the future is to have a conversation around what are the flags that are really relevant for, maybe in my case, the world economy and South Africa, but in your case, it might be around my business and the industry I'm in, and maybe it'll be around your family and which country you should be living in and stuff like that. But the first thing is to look at the flags, which would give you an indication of what is driving the present into the future. The second thing is to say, okay, given these flags, what are the possible scenarios that can flow out of the flags? And you don't want to write too many scenarios. Scott showed you a nice matrix, which I had a few years ago. At the moment, as you'll see, I'm running 2 scenarios for the world and 2 scenarios for South Africa. But you've obviously got to consider what the best and worst possible futures that can flow out of the flags. And then thirdly, you've got to consider the probabilities that you apply right now to these best and worst scenarios, given the status of the flags you've chosen. So it's a simple methodology. It's not like some of those management textbooks where you have to go into huge sort of scratching your head because you don't really understand the methodology. It's a simple 3-step methodology. And I have to say that it's used by a lot of overseas companies now to have their conversation around the table. And I hope it's a round table at the same time. There are 2 things which you've got to avoid at all costs when you look at the future. And I'll be bringing up an example of that. You've got to pierce through the emotion. A lot of people only want to consider futures that are desirable. And the whole point of flags is to prick the veil of emotion that we have, to say, gosh, could it really go this way? Which means that I've got to do some uncomfortable things in order to maintain my, my wealth or my standing or my company, whatever it is. You have to consider those uncomfortable questions. Socrates would have really, enthused about that particular part of the approach. And the other thing is, you can't be too precise about the future. My first mentor was a man called Pierre Wack, who was a Frenchman and who was the head of scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell during the 70s. And I'll be quoting him a bit more further on. But one of the things he said was, it's much better to be vaguely right than absolutely precisely wrong. And that is the point of our technique, to be vaguely right rather than absolutely right. And I think the best example I can quote to you of that is the actual book I wrote with Chantal Ilbury, who is the mother of Mitchell, with whom I wrote this book, Thinking the Future. And Chantal and I wrote this book, The Mind of a Fox, which was published in June 2001. And for the first 3 months, it didn't sell that well, but then something happened which turned it into an overnight hit. And it was the best-selling book in South Africa in 2002. And in 2003, it was number 2 because Harry Potter was number 1. And yeah, I think it's sold over 80,000 books altogether here, which is a lot. And we were very pleased. But what happened to turn it into a bestseller was that we actually included a book to George Bush in the second half of the book, where we said, "Dear Mr. President, if you want to overcome all the obstacles and problems and see the opportunities of your presidency, you've got to start thinking like a fox." And we said, as we speak, the biggest threat that you have is a massive terrorist strike on a Western city. And yeah, that could completely upend your presidency. Now, notice we didn't say New York or an American city, we said a Western city. But we had this in our book. And it was amazing that, of course, 9/11 happened on September the 1st. And 6 months later, someone from the US State Department rang me and said, "We've done a literature search, Mr. Sunter, and yours is the only book published anywhere in the world which, in a letter to the president, said that a massive event like 9/11 could happen. How come?" So obviously I felt a bit queasy about being considered a person of interest. But I said we had 3 flags, which indicated that this particular scenario had increased in probability. The first was the fact that religions in the late 80s had become much more confrontational between each other, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, but particularly Islam and fundamental Islam. And of course, the 90s saw a lot of terrorist strikes on aircraft, hijacking aircraft, and obviously individual strikes on the ground. And that was our second flag because it showed that terrorist groups had become more sophisticated in their strategy and tactics. But the third flag was why we included it in the book, which was there were 2 attacks by Al-Qaeda on American embassies in Africa, one in Tanzania and the other in Kenya in 1998, which we felt was a dress rehearsal for the real thing in America. And that's why we included it in the book, because we thought the risk level had risen. Well, thank heavens he believed what we said. But what was really nice was that overnight our book became a huge success in America, but equally our website, Mind of a Fox, which actually topped these strategic arena charts in America for about 2 years, according to Google. And they said it's the only time a foreign website has been so dominant in America in a particular discipline. So, yeah, we weren't saying that it was going to happen 3 months after 9/11, after we'd written the book, and that it was going to be in New York and that it was going to involve planes. But the whole point of putting that kind of general scenario on the table is just to become much more sensitive to the incoming subflags. And it was at the US Congress inquiry into 9/11, there was a young woman who went to her boss on 6 occasions, and said, "Boss, there's a flying school down the road where Arabs are learning to take off but not land." And she said, "It's not just that flying school. There's a really large number of young Arab people learning to fly planes around America at the moment, and we should look into it." And her boss said, "Nah, don't think so." And in fact, the 19 pilots who were involved in 9/11 were educated at these flying schools. So it shows how you've got to have that ability to take a general flag and then make it more precise. So I'd like to now go through the flags, which I've been advancing to many clients over the last few years. And as I said, most of them are in this book, Flag Watching. So, you can still get this on Amazon. the first flag is the religious flag, and in fact, it is the first flag in this book. It was first put on the table, as I said, in the late 80s. It was a guy called Ted Newland, who was Pierre Wax #2. And we were having a kind of Anglo scenario meeting at a wonderful pub in Midhurst in England. It's called the Spread Eagle. And we followed this whole thing of not sitting at long tables. We sat around the pub, we sat in a particular room, and we discussed the future all the time. And Ted said, I'm going to give you a flag, which all of you guys are going to say, oh no, come on, Ted. And he said, it's the flag of religion. And of course we did. We said, gosh, Ted, but there's been no, war this century, big war around religion, because both the First World War and the Second World War was around territory. It wasn't around religion. You've got to go back to the Crusades and things that happened elsewhere in the world in previous centuries to get back to religion. And he said, I've been speaking to an expert who attended one of the fundamental Islamic schools in Saudi Arabia. And he said, what came out of listening to the guys educating the students was that this is actually going to be a driving force for the next 50 years. And he was absolutely right. And I'd like to read you something I said about the flag in July 2023. I said this: the religious flag resulting from the major religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism competing more intensely with one another. This flag led to 9/11 in September 2001 and is now focused on the current unrest in Israel and the likelihood of Iran developing a nuclear bomb. And there were two reasons that I kind of said the flag had moved on from watching America and Europe to watching Israel, which was that at the time, Netanyahu was trying to weaken the judiciary system. I don't know whether it had to do with his corruption trial, which has just started again. But he was trying to weaken the judiciary system, and there were huge demonstrations in Jerusalem against the government, which one very rarely sees in Israel. So it was one of their kind of really weakest points in July 2023. And then the second thing is they were still granting land to settlers in the West Bank, which was increasing the fury of Palestinians there, but also Palestinians elsewhere. And it wasn't that we said that, 3 months' time, it's like 9/11, that there's going to be an attack on Israel. But we said the risk has gone up, and therefore you should be looking at any flags that might be considered associated with this general flag. And indeed, if you read the New York Times subsequent to the dreadful attack by Hamas, you would have come across an article that was about a lady called V. Her full name wasn't given the article, but she was quite a senior member of IDF intelligence. And she had a group of junior officers, junior privates, female privates, around the fence, observing Hamas when they were drilling on the surface. And she actually wrote a scenario around about July 2023, when at the same time that I published this article, which was called The Walls of Jericho. And it was taken from a Hamas document. She called it The Walls of Jericho. And it was a scenario of a mass attack on Israel. And her boss, rather like the American FBI boss who just waved the woman away, who were talking about Arab pilots at American flying schools, her boss just said, no, it's a fanciful scenario. It won't happen. And it was for exactly the same reason, which is that he totally underestimated the enemy of Hamas. just like the CIA underestimated the enemy of Al Qaeda. You have to consider the flag and whether actually that basic kind of emotional thing of the enemy will never be able to do something like this is actually the wrong assumption, because it happened 3 months later. And I've had incredible calls from the Jewish community here in South Africa and also in America saying, how on earth could you, have put this flag on the table when Mossad, which is considered one of the most intelligent agencies in the world, didn't have it on its radar system? And I said, I don't know. And indeed, I couldn't have possibly said it was going to happen 3 months after, but that's why they should have listened to this woman. They should have had that approach that when somebody has a piece of evidence, you sit at a round table, you have those sort of frontline people gathering evidence with the analysts on the other side of the table, and you have a conversation about whether this is a genuine flag or not. You don't just ignore it. Now, where is that flag going to take Israel now? I don't know, because unfortunately, the kind of religious rage between Islam and Judaism is still very much there. And, with this whole handing back of the hostages, you can see that Hamas is still in existence in the Gaza Strip. And, there is that scenario that they just gather themselves together again if Israel just leaves Gaza alone. Trump has his own ideas about Gaza, that that America should take over Gaza and sort of build a Riviera resort there. But I don't think that goes down well with the neighboring Arab countries, because they think the forceful removal of 2 million people is simply totally unethical. So yeah, it's a very, very difficult thing to see where it ends. And obviously the second half of the flag, which I quoted in July 2023, of this question of Iran developing a nuclear weapon, must be very high on the mind of Israel and America. And so one of the kind of possibilities is for a major attack on Iran to destroy their nuclear facilities. Because, both the US and Iran feel that Iran is behind all the kind of terrorist groups that have attacked Israel, and they call it the Iran axis, the Iranian axis. So we'll have to wait and see. But I have to say, my kind of view of a peace scenario, and we've obviously had the first phase of the ceasefire, which is, releasing hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. That's gone as far as about it can go, but there are still hostages left in Gaza, and the Israelis want to extend the first phase, but Hamas wants to move on to the second phase now, so that it gets Israel right out of the system in Gaza. And everything is fraught with this kind of religious difference. And it's why it's so difficult at the moment to see a genuine positive scenario of Israeli Jews and Palestinians working together towards a common future, because there is this very divisive flag of religion. The second flag I added after I'd written Flag Watch. It's called the leadership flag. And I wrote it I think it was about 3 years ago. I first incorporated it because I've been working for a company which had a very strong leader. And it was quite clear to me that he dominated all the discussions. And I thought to myself, gosh, it really depends on the quality of your leader in many ways as to how a company will actually perform. So when you do an analysis of a company and whether you should invest in it, you've got to look at the quality of the CEO and decide whether you think the guy is a reasonable guy, because That's an incredibly important aspect of the future. I remember quoting in the article I wrote for News 24 when I first brought up the flag, my father, who worked in London in the late 30s for Midland Bank. He was progressing up the system, but there was this young guy in Germany who was progressing up the leadership ladder called Adolf Hitler. And it changed my father's life completely because he had to resign from the bank in 1939, join the British Army, fight for 6 years. Thank heavens he survived. And then he became a stockbroker. But that is the kind of incredible influence over your personal life that a global leader can have. And interestingly, I've since written about the flag, and I haven't ever been that positive about the current leadership around the world. I said the last time we had real global leadership in the world was in the late 80s, when you had Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Mikhail Gorbachev. And they had a positive relationship with one another, and they brought an end to the Soviet Union and the downing of the Berlin Wall. And yeah, for a time, the world really came together under those three leaders. So it was as much of the relationship between them as the fact that they were pretty good individual leaders. In our case, we had the leadership flag of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, which got us over those very difficult times in the early 90s. But, we haven't had great leadership. I mean, there you've had dear old, you've had American leaders who are very, very old. I mean, Joe Biden probably wouldn't qualify for the Helderberg retirement village that I'm in. But now you've got Trump, and Trump is doing things which are just changing people's lives everywhere, absolutely changing them upside down. I mean, I was just listening to the news because I like to do that before giving a lecture like this. And there's the Canadian head, Justin Trudeau, saying it is absolutely ridiculous to have these 25% tariffs on Canadian exports to America, because it just makes everything that much more expensive in America. And he says, we're going to do the same to America. And if you look back to the 1930s, what triggered the Great Depression in the 1930s was this kind of nationalistic conflict that there was in the markets, which didn't allow people to trade freely with one another. And we're getting into that situation now because we have Trump as a leader. It's only for 4 years, but there he is as a leader, and he really is affecting people's lives. He's affected people's lives here with cancelling US aid and all the PEPFAR funding for HIV/AIDS people in South Africa and children. And it's going to cause a huge amount of deaths in South Africa because he's just decided to get rid of it. But obviously, we have to be worried that we've got the AGOA agreement coming up for renewal. And I must say, Trump expresses opinions on South Africa where, the agreement may not be renewed. So it is incredibly important to look at leaders. And I've always thought of Putin as an autocrat, because there was the poisoning of that couple in Salisbury with Novichok. And, I can't say that he's a nice guy at all. And she is, in fact, more like Mao than Deng Xiaoping, who really changed the Chinese economy. So we don't have a bunch of good leaders in the world at the moment. And of course, what the one thing that Trump is doing is completely changing the relationship between Europe and the United States. Well, and obviously Canada and the United States as well, and Mexico and the United States. But sure, that one person can do this is just an amazing kind of quality of our species. The third flag is what I called in the book Flag Watching, the red flag of Russia, China, and North Korea. In fact, I spent 10 pages in the book on the Ukraine because Russia had already invaded the Ukraine, well, not the whole of Ukraine as they tried to earlier this decade, but Crimea, they had annexed Crimea, and they were trying to take parts of the eastern side of Ukraine. And I said, this flag has to be watched very carefully because it could end up being a World War III between America and Russia. But in fact, the scenario that seems to be developing is that Trump wants to do a deal with Putin, and he wants to do it without any Ukrainian or European kind of presence at the discussions, and do it in some Arab country and then present it to all the parties. But they may well refuse it. And so, it's a very interesting flag. Now, I think the probability of a peace deal is higher than it was when I last spoke to you. But we'll just have to wait and see. And obviously, one of the fears that most people have about this flag is that it will be the sort of Neville Chamberlain situation of peace in our time. It may be a deal for a short time, but it will just allow Putin, enough time to rearm and then think of taking over other countries as well. And obviously, the one thing that everybody found dreadful was the kind of spat in the White House between Vance and Trump on the one side and Zelensky on the other side. The second of the part of the flag is China, which has kept remarkably silent on the Ukraine, because there's one part of the Chinese flag which we have to watch very carefully, which is Taiwan. I mean, they are doing these endless exercises in the South China Seas, and apparently they've just been doing exercises off New Zealand and Australia. The Chinese are building up their defense and military might, and you've got to go on watching this, because I don't know what Trump would do if China actually invaded Taiwan. It remains to be seen whether he's going to take an unorthodox view on that. But at the moment, it would mean that America would be committed to a war against China if that actually happened. I personally still give it a low probability, because I think that the Chinese just want to keep Taiwan in the fold, so to speak. They know that if they invade the place, they'll suffer heavy losses, but they'll also destroy the island that they want to take over, which at the moment has a magnificent economy. So I'm not sure that Xi actually wants to do anything at the moment. So I still give it a low probability. And then there's North Korea, which is the third part of the flag. And you just have to go on watching that, even though there hasn't been much news about Kim Jong-un recently. Obviously, he shook hands with Trump in the demilitarized zone when Trump was last president. So maybe they have telephone calls to one another. I don't know. But, there's North Korea with 40 to 50 nuclear weapons. They've upgraded their ballistic missile system. They're still doing ballistic missile tests. And there's always the possibility that they could invade South Korea because, they are two natural enemies of one another. The next flag is, as I said, a clockwork flag. It's the gray flag of the aging of the world's population. And again, this flag was first thought up by Pierre Wack in 1988, when he said to me at one of our meetings, and maybe at the same meeting that Ted raised the religious flag, he said, you know what? If Japan ever has a property crash, its economy will never grow at the rate it has done in the 70s and 80s again. It's been growing at 7 to 8%. It will fall to 0.5%, if that, if there is a property and stock market crash in 1990, well, whenever. And I said, why is that, Pierre? And he said, because they're the oldest nation on earth. They have the highest percentage of people over 65 in the world. And yeah, old people don't do as much. They don't invent as much. You know, they just have to live. And if the population is really old, they start declining because you don't have that sort of reproduction that you have with a young population. And what's happened in Japan is that the population is declining quite quickly. And Japan has fallen to an economic growth rate between 0.5%. So that flag is still in my portfolio, but obviously I've been looking at other aspects of the flag. And one of them is that Europe and the UK are going through exactly the same problems as Japan did in 1990. They're old populations. And in a sense, having migrants does bring down the age of the population. Even Japan now is importing migrants to do that. But you know, you've got to say to yourself, there is no scenario where Europe and the UK are going to go back to a high economic growth rate, because you know the grey flag is absolutely up the flagpole there, and that applies to China now, because China had the one-child policy. China is now a middle-aged country, and its population is declining. In fact, there's one forecast I saw recently that China's population could fall to 700 million by the turn of the century from 1.3 billion. That would be huge. But it has affected Chinese economic growth to have this kind of aging of its population and at the same time have a declining population. America, funnily enough, this flag will only hit in the second half of this century, but it is going to be hit by it. And the more migrants they expel from America, the more problems they're going to have with essential workers, because that's where young workers are needed. And already I'm hearing stories from California that a lot of the migrants that Trump wants to sort of expel from there because they're undocumented or whatever it is, are actually, you know, very, very fearful and not working properly. And 42% of construction workers in California are migrants. So it shows that there is a very important role for young migrants in particular countries, and that this could affect America in the second half of this century, in which case they'll obviously have to change their policy of sort of zero immigration unless you've got $5 million or something else to get a sort of golden visa into America. Developing countries in Africa and South America still have young populations, but you have to obviously have other things as well, like good government. So it doesn't assure you of a high economic growth rate. Though in some African countries, you're seeing the highest economic growth rates in the world at the moment because they do have quite good government. The next flag is the green flag of climate change, which I regard as probably the most existential flag in the portfolio. And again, it was brought up in a book that I wrote with two South African environmentalists, Roy Siegfried, and just trying to think of his name, the other guy, Roy Siegfried, I'll get his name in a second, but the two of them actually said in the book, I didn't write this, that it wasn't the warming up of the world that really, Roy Siegfried and Brian Huntley, sorry, those are the two guys, Roy Siegfried, Brian Huntley. It wasn't the warming up of the world that really one should be watching out for, because yes, the sea levels would rise and they would eventually drown coastal cities. But it was the fact that warmer weather would create more extreme weather, more extreme rainfall, more extreme dry periods. And that is what's happening around the world. In California, they now talk about atmospheric rivers, because not only are clouds getting more filled with rain because, of course, of higher temperatures. But the upper atmosphere is becoming more segmented so that you can have a very specific rainfall over a specific area, which is, 1 year's rainfall in 24 hours because of this kind of atmospheric river. And of course, there are other places which are suffering terrible droughts at the same time. Unfortunately, as I've said in previous articles about this flag, it can only be overcome with cooperation between different countries. But unfortunately, Trump doesn't believe in climate change. And secondly, you haven't got the kind of cooperation you require between rich and poor countries to have a collective kind of strategy to lower the risk of this particular flag. The anti-establishment flag, again, mentioned in this book, the fact that since 2008, the financial crash, the gap between the ultra-rich and on the one side and the middle class and the working class on the other side has widened hugely because the ultra-rich are even richer than they were in 2007. But there are a lot of working people and people in the middle class who in real terms are poorer than they were in 2007. I mean, I just take the salary of a national health nurse in the UK. They're saying that that nurse is earning less in real terms than they did in 2007. And of course, this has caused fury. It's changed the political dynamic of countries, and that's why they're electing far more extreme leaders and much more nationalistic leaders around the world. The next flag is the porous border flag, which first went up when I facilitated a conference for Interpol in 2009, where we were looking at what the 10 principal risks were facing the world over the next 10 years, from 2010 to 2020. And they came up with a list, and we had the deputy head of the FBI, and we had the head of Scotland Yard, and we had virtually the head of all the police forces around the world. And the first thing really made me go, wow, because it wasn't a crime. Obviously some people consider it a crime, but it was porous borders. And it was the fact that, that Western countries had very little protection against all the people who wanted to pour in from poorer countries, and that this figure would grow exponentially during the next 10 years. As this American guy said, he said, we do have very sophisticated border posts, but you just go 100 meters on either side of our border posts. We have nothing. And there we are. It's created these terrible problems in America, which Trump is trying to sort out, but it's created terrible problems in in Europe and the UK. And indeed, yesterday, they had the largest migrant boat hitting the UK shores this year of 600 people. So I'm not sure, again, how this porous border flag plays out, because obviously you can't shoot people in their boats or anything like that. You've got to actually accept them. It's actually a tragedy when you have people fleeing to have a better life somewhere else, and the last thing you can really do is punish them in a vicious way. So yeah, that's why we've got to still continue watching this flag. But obviously Trump has done a lot to try and bring that flag down in his own mind. But just remember the point I made with the aging flag, that at some stage America is going to require young migrants as essential workers to keep up the maintenance of cities and other things like that. The next flag, the national debt flag, is mentioned in flag watching. And it was there because I did a session with a few of the banks in London, and they were worrying in around about, I think, 2010 about the national debt around the world. And all that's happened because of the easy money policies we've had ever since the crash of 2008, and then we had COVID, is that the figures have absolutely shot up. And I mean, the country I quote is America, that has a national debt of $35 trillion and a national GDP figure of 27 trillion. So that's a ratio in excess of 125%. And in the 90s, it was considered an acceptable ceiling to have a ratio of 60% of GDP for your national debt. Well, America is now double that. And, I don't know whether what Trump is doing is going to sort of bring down the federal deficit or not. But it's been running under Joe Biden at $2 to $3 trillion a year, and that's why it's so massively high now. And of course, in Europe, they're now saying we've got to spend more on defense, but a lot of them have the similar problem that they've got very, very high national debts. And of course, if interest rates rise, you have to service that debt. The pandemic flag, obviously, I did write about it in this book, but I didn't write about COVID. But it proved that I was right to include it in our suite of flags in the book, because what COVID showed is what massive disturbance there can be to the world economy when you have a pandemic like COVID. Thankfully, it's now much more gentle variants in the world, but you can't take it off your radar system because there may well be other viruses that create the same kind of conditions, flu viruses or whatever it is. So just keep it on your radar system. A new flag I added again about a year to 2 years ago is the crowded space flag, that you have all these rockets now going up into space. And, at the same time, you've got far more crowded satellite systems around the world. And at some stage, you might have a massive accident in the sky, causing fragments to then take out other satellites and everything else. And remember, the world banking system and many other information systems, GPS, rely on these global satellite systems. The last time a law was passed on space was 1967 by the UN, which is space is free for all. There have been no laws on space since then. But maybe now, because the risk has gone up, there's going to have to be more laws about space, particularly now that you've got so many private companies sending rockets into space as well. And then the last flag is, again, a much more recent flag, but I put it there because technology has such a huge impact on our lives. As you can see, how what the mobile phone has done to our lives. You walk into any restaurant, anywhere, people are talking on their phones. 30 or 40 years ago, nobody did that because there wasn't the device. Now they do. And of course, now it is artificial intelligence. And we've heard all about the good side of artificial intelligence and the negative side of artificial intelligence being used to scam people or to raid their bank accounts or to create false videos of people. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people saying with artificial intelligence, we can actually make our company much more productive, and productivity can be increased. And equally, when you want to know about something, you just ask a question like Socrates of artificial intelligence, and you'll get some answer. But there is a thing called hallucinations with artificial intelligence. When you read the answer, be careful that you're not getting some false facts quoted in that response. Because a lot of the people who I know who are very AI savvy have said you must be very careful because of the hallucinations that you can get from AI. Now, the two mainstream scenarios that flow out of those flags, and as I said, a lot of them are very old flags, and they weren't provided by me, they were provided by other people. The first one is friendly planet where, the world gets together and resolves that dreadful flag of climate change, and actually we get back to freedom of movement, of trade, of people, and all that kind of stuff to make the world a better place like we did in the late 80s and 90s. And that's the friendly planet scenario. And as I said, the leadership flag at the moment would mean that I give a very low probability to that scenario. And the second is called gilded cage. It's where the West gets inside the cage and just tries to keep the rest of the world outside the cage. And I thought that was a fairly reasonable scenario until Trump started the fight in the cage. And now, it's just amazing. You have this incredible division between Europe and America and Canada and America. And obviously, people are trying to paper it over with diplomatic speech. But the reality is there's just a lot more dissension inside the cage, the gilded cage, than there was. So I'm not sure how much longer the gilded cage can last. And of course, you've got the BRICS community outside the cage, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, who were the original members, and now plenty of other members. And of course, that's leading to a kind of alternative to NATO and the G20 and so forth and so on. So, yeah, I certainly will be looking at other global scenarios from now on, given the way the flags have moved under Trump. On the South African flags, I'll go through them fairly quickly. I've got the crime and corruption flag, which I've had for a very long time. It was in this book. And yes, I think we've definitely made progress since Jacob Zuma, and that, people when he was president. I think that we do have a much more transparent approach in trying to bring criminals to justice. But having said that, we haven't seen the kind of legal action and consequences that you would see if the crime and corruption flag was to turn truly green. So there's so much work that still has to be done on that flag. And equally, we've got to think of how much more effort we've got to be put into expanding the police force, and also, obviously, all the people involved in sort of the sort of not the sort of gun crime, but the sort of bureaucratic crime. How are we going to resolve this? The second flag is the quality of infrastructure, and yeah, we felt much better about this flag because yes, we had the other day we had Eskom going back to stage 6, but nevertheless, we can feel a little bit better about this flag around Eskom, but there's a long way to go on things like the ports and Transnet and others. And it does mean that we're going to need a far greater alliance between GNU, the Government of National Union, and the private sector in order to turn the quality of infrastructure green. I remember when I did a session with the Chinese Communist Party in 2006 in Beijing at the Central Party School, which is their leadership academy, and produces the 5-year economic plan for China. And I remember being shown around the school after we had a day's work there. I'd done a day's work there. And I remember saying to one professor, whose quote is that on the wall? Because it was all in Chinese. He said, Deng Xiaoping. So I said, really? And what does he say? Well, at the time, our economy was the 100th ranked in the world. And he said, we've got to do 2 things in order to take China up. Firstly, we've got to improve the quality of infrastructure. So we, the Chinese Communist Party, must, with the communities, improve the airports, the roads, the railways, and everything else in China so that we have a platform for economic growth. And the second thing he said is, I think that people should be allowed to create wealth for themselves, which went completely against the communist ideology, but it worked. because China, as he said, went from the 100th ranked economy to the 5th ranked economy in 2006. And of course, it's now the second largest economy in the world, and probably is the only country that can rival America in AI and high tech. I'm afraid to say Europe and the UK really are no longer in that sort of league that China and America are in high tech. So he did transform China. He did transform China, and I have to say one of the best examples of flags was that day, because they wanted to understand how scenario planning could be used to road test the 5-year economic plans that they were designing for China. And I did a real example in the afternoon, and I said, what is it? And it was about 45 academics in the room in the afternoon. I said, what is it that most worries you in the world at the moment? And they said an American recession, not an American crash. They said an American recession. And so I said, well, let's write a scenario around that. We wrote a scenario. And then I said, what about the flag that would indicate that a recession is rising in probability? And they went into a huddle and they said, we've come up with one flag, and that is property prices in America. Because we know that America, has very high percentage for consumer spending. 2/3 of the American economy is consumer spending. And if the price of the principal asset that America has falls, which is the house that a consumer has, then they'll stop spending as much. And as we have $1.75 trillion worth of US bonds, it would be very worrying for us. And guess what? In September to December 2006, they wrote to me and said, we're keeping tabs on the Case-Shiller index, which measures property prices in America. And for the first time in 25 years, it's actually leveled out. And then they sent me another email in the first quarter of 2007 saying prices had fallen in America, property prices. And they were now giving an 80% probability to a recession scenario. And we all know what happened in September of that year. That's when the great crash started happening in America. I don't know what they did as a result of that probability, but it was probably to do with expanding the internal demand in China to make up for the loss of demand that they might have for exports to America. And maybe they moved some of their treasuries out of America as well. But it absolutely shows why it's important to get that flag right. The third flag is the entrepreneurship flag, which I've been going on for a long time, because the world of work has changed. In the last century, hundreds of thousands of jobs were being created by big business and even by governments. But now that's no longer the case. Big business has become much more productive. It subcontracts more. Governments, as I said, all around the world, their debt ratios are worrying them. And so the only place that is actually creating jobs of a huge amount is small business. In fact, the latest statistic from America is 2/3 of the jobs being created today in America are from small businesses around the country. So we've got to do everything to promote small business in this country, to integrate the township economies with the mainstream economy, and to really provide finance to all those entrepreneurs in rural and urban areas who want to, open up new businesses, because that's the only way we're going to get rid of our hideous unemployment rate of over 40%. The fourth flag previously was the 2024 election, which I said would probably end up in some kind of coalition government, and it has. It's ended up with GNU. And I just hope that GNU holds together, because it is incredibly important that we have a kind of working, a working, functioning government. And I can't think of any other form of government in South Africa at the moment, besides GNU, that would, begin to get that pragmatic approach about it. I mean, I actually wrote an article just after Cyril had formed the GNU called Pragmatism, because pragmatism is absolutely top of the scale for me. You've got to do things that work. I visited Nelson Mandela a month before he was released. He asked me to go and see him in Victor Verster near Paarl. He didn't tell me he was being released in February 1990. I saw him in January 1990. But he read one of my books, and he sat me down and he said, "I'm afraid to say, Mr. Sunter, but my favorite quote in the book is not from you, it's from Deng Xiaoping, who you quote." So I said, "Oh, what did he say in the book?" So I just couldn't remember at the moment because I was, quite confused being in the same room with Nelson Mandela. He said, "I don't care if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." And he says, that's my philosophy as well. And you could see his passion for reconciliation flowing through all the questions he had about the future, which conversation took place over a period of 5 hours. So I had 5 hours one-on-one with the great man. And I never really met him in such circumstances after that, but I was just delighted that I could at least assist on that. And it applies absolutely now. GNU's got to come out with policies that, really work to get us our economy growing. And then there are 2 more flags. The first, I quote from this article, which is the neutrality flag. We're now in a mess because Trump has made it a big point that we took Israel to the International Court of Justice. It's sad because, when you want to be a winning nation, you want to be able to export your products everywhere in the world. And I just pray and hope that we still can export our products to America when AGOA is up for renewal. But we'll just have to wait and see with this neutrality flag. And then the last flag was out of the book, and it was the final flag on the South African side in flag watching, and it was land reform. And of course, that has been a huge subject with Trump, saying basically that Afrikaans farmers can move to America and stop all the kind of racist stuff going on in South Africa in expropriating land for nothing. And land reform is a very, very tricky issue. But nevertheless, it is an issue. And we are going to have to do something to widen the ownership of land in this country. I actually did some work with a farmer outside Nature's Valley, a dairy farmer who was one of the largest in the country. And he had actually done 2 things. He'd allocated a small percentage of his own farm to all his employees. But the second thing he did was buy the farm next door, form a trust, and all the employees that he has are members of that trust. And I thought, gosh, that is a first. And it's the kind of thing that other farmers can do to try and take the sting out of the land reform issue. Because make no mistake, we still got to have good management of land in this country because we are a highly non-arable country. It's, I know people quote statistics about this country, but a large part of our country is desert. And in the fertile areas, you simply can't have lots of little farms. You've got to have big farming to create the kind of food supply that we need. And I think about 80% of our food supply comes from 20% of our farm. But that's what has to happen in South Africa, given the nature of our climate and the ratio between arable and non-arable land. That leads to 2 scenarios. The first is called people's economy, which is where we have a similar thing to CODESA. But this one we call a kind of eco-DESA. It's an economic get-together on how we can create this entrepreneurial economy. we've done the politics. The politics was done in the first half of the last century. We got a constitution that is a very good constitution. So that's all done and dusted. But now the much more difficult question of creating a people's economy, and we should be having a similar kind of assembly of people from the private sector and government, from GNU, to create this people's economy, and obviously to discuss things like land reform as well. But maybe that needs a separate agridessert. The alternative is the cautionary tale scenario, where our economic growth rate sits at sub 1% and even maybe turns negative, where violence rises, and which could end in a civil war if you don't have the right leadership here. And yeah, it could turn us into a failed state. So it is the kind of equivalent to the high road and low road, but updated in the sense that we've now got to concentrate on creating an inclusive economy, or we could still go the route of the low road and the wasteland. So there you have it. I've given you the methodology. I've given you the flags. You can, I think, still get this book, Flag Watching, on the internet, and certainly Thinking the Future is still available on the internet. I'm not sure you can get them in exclusive books now, but yeah, I really hope that you will get together in small groups around a round table, use the kind of flag methodology, and consider the flags which are appropriate to your particular circumstances, and then the scenarios, and then the probabilities, and then constantly update those flags. You don't have to constantly change the flags or anything. As I said, some of these flags have been here since the late 80s, but you've got to watch at how that flag has changed. And then you've got to actually, like a fox, be agile and do something about it, which is exactly what Scott mentioned he would do. And lastly, I'd like to leave you all with a benediction. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.
Clem, thank you very much. It's as always, it's been wonderful. Could I ask you, I mean, there's lots of questions coming through, but if you were to take the probability for the two global scenarios, and I know you said a very low probability now with everything Trump's doing, but if you were to give a guess, what would you say the probability is for your two global scenarios?
I've been asked that, 10% for Friendly Planet with Trump as leader, 90% Gilded Cage. But even Gilded Cage doesn't cover what's happening because, as I said, a fight has broken out inside the Gilded Cage. And we've got to create a third scenario where the bars of the cage are bust in the by the confrontation inside the cage.
And for the South African scenarios?
Well, GNU, you see, I obviously watched this and I thought, oh, wow, the other day when the budget speech had to be stopped because there'd been no agreement over the 2% VAT increase, I thought, oh, my word, maybe GNU is going to fail. But obviously there's a strong, strong desire to keep GNU going, and I hope that is maintained. But obviously GNU have got to reach out now much more to find a sort of social consensus on what to do with the economy, and that's why we should have an economic codessa and maybe an agridessert as well. So that's still to come, but I can't think of anything that can be better than the GNU that we've got at the moment. So I give the people's economy scenario. I would give it a 40 to 50% probability, and I would give the cautionary tale 50 to 60%. In other words, I'm still worried that we haven't done anything properly to get onto into that scenario of a people's economy.
Okay, sure, because that has slipped a bit. I remember the last time we did this, it was kind of 50-50. So in terms of the process.
Because I thought the GNU would really get on with it in terms of, as I said, pragmatism and start getting people together and stuff, but we just haven't seen that. And you've got to have that sort of interaction to find out what it is you can do to create a much more open economy for all those township businesses that are doing great things, but they cannot expand outside of their own townships. In that sense, we still have economic apartheid in this country, and we've got to really do something about it. I mean, we did something about it in Anglo in the 90s. We created a project called Zimeni, where around all our mines, we went to the local communities and said, what can you produce for our mines? And we actually signed contracts. We even put some of our mining people on the boards of those companies, and they did very well. And I don't know how they're doing now, but they then had other clients. So all in all, it was a very good idea.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, well, as you said to everyone, let's make sure that we join that conversation. And so if people go to that link that Shane has posted, you can literally post questions here in terms of what Clem has shared. I do want to just share with you what I do think is important is that now it's about taking those scenarios, those flags, and those probabilities, and actually implementing them. And like I said to you, I've created a short, it's literally 12 or 13-minute video with a blueprint training to actually help you take the information to make smart decisions and to build your diversified passive income. So if you are interested, you literally go to that link, askclemsunter.com/4D. And as a bonus to anyone that signs up, you're also going to get access to our Wealth Weekend in terms of that overall process. So I will just let you know about that. I will share, a video in the email of a lovely lady, Cynthia, who is based in Italy. And she talks a lot. She's American-based in Italy, and she talks a lot. She's a single mom about how do you do it from a diversification and from a partnership perspective. I'll share this video with you. If it is something of interest to you, you can book a call. So literally sit down with one of our team members. They can actually help you to understand the next steps in terms of diversification and your investments. And it's literally free. There's no sales pitch involved. So it's really understanding where you're at. And to do that, you just go to askclem.com/call. I want to share a quick video with you, and then we're going to pivot into the Q&A. It's a lovely video. We were talking earlier about farmers, and this is a farmer, and he spent most of his life, actually 42 years to be exact, digging and creating money by planting fields. And this was his excitement when he actually started to earn a passive income.
Scott, can you remember when you were a little kid and it was Christmas morning and you opened your Christmas presents? Huh? Can you remember that? That's what I feel like.
I have a little kid, so I get reminded quite regularly at the moment.
I tell you what, amazing. And I only just got a few dollars back in my investments again. It's the second payment I got in that I've seen on my wallet, and it's money that I didn't have to slog for. I had to think for it, but I didn't have to slog for, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's just when you start seeing your money work for you, it's just an absolutely indescribable feeling. And as a farmer now, I've got a very specific goal, which says that I need to build alternate income streams so that the weather doesn't matter. Because that's being a crop farmer, the weather matters very much, and particularly this past year. When your income for a year is only 30% of what your expenses will be, you're in a difficult position. And to be energized and as excited as what I am in that position is incredibly empowering. Thanks, Scott.
So if you'd like similar results to what Derek and others that I've already shown you are getting, then we've literally got this free training for you, the 40 Wealth Blueprint, where we take a lot of what Clem has shared and actually help you make smart decisions for yourself in building diversified passive income. And it is a unique thing, but literally starting tomorrow, we have our Wealth Weekend. Clem, you talk a lot about conversations, and this is actually an incredible opportunity for 2.5 days where people are getting together to talk about wealth and diversification. But let's pivot now into kind of questions. And there's a lot of questions, and I've tried to kind of curate these questions. But the first one that comes through, Clem, is given the volatility in the US, Europe, and China, which regions do you see emerging as the new economic powerhouses over the next decade?
Well, the fact is that despite Trump, America is, still one of the most innovative economies in the world. And so I think that his kind of, quarrel with Europe and everything else, which has created this more divided world, and now tariffs have come in, it just means that, it's made America the sort of almost the country of choice to invest in, because, as I said, because of the grey flag of aging, Europe and the UK are not doing well. But obviously, there are companies in Europe and in the UK who are worth investing in, because despite having a fairly stagnant economy, those companies are, doing well. So I'm not for one moment saying you should have zero investment in Europe and the UK. You've just got to be a lot more careful about where you choose. Japan is still a reasonable economy to invest in. India, you've obviously got to know about the place. You've got to have Indian advisors helping you, because it is an economy that is going to be one of the top 3 economies in the world in the second half of the century. So India could become a place to park part of your money. And in South America and Africa, it's very much a question of, saying which governments are on the whole doing a good job for their country. And a lot of people are investing in Namibia for them at the moment, because they feel the Namibian government is doing a great deal for the economy there. I hesitate to nominate a country in the north, because I don't know enough about those economies. But there has to be a conversation with a person who's knowledgeable about the quality of government of those countries, and that applies to South America as well, before you sort of place a significant amount of money in those countries.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about Namibia. I had someone literally in the last month, they had a golf course and they were wanting me to help people invest in the golf course. And then they got citizenship, and I was a little bit intrigued. It feels like we've gone full circle. There's a question here. How do you think South Africa's land bill and Trump's vocal criticism of it could affect international investment and trade relations? I know you've already spoken about AGOA. I mean, is there anything else with regards to that?
I feel quite uneasy about that, at the moment, because we do export a lot to America. And yes, we've got the BRICS. And I think it's a good thing that we're a member of BRICS, even though Russia, we all know about Russia. But I do think it's good to be a member of another international body. But maybe being a member of BRICS means that we in Trump's world, we're seen as an enemy of America. I just don't know. But it's very, very worrying, some of the things that he said and done about this country. I mean, I'm absolutely so upset about the PEPFAR money being ended, because that was started by George Bush, and it was one of the best things that he did to bring down the number of fatalities of HIV/AIDS victims, but also to stop transmission of the virus. So I'm afraid to say, passing the Land Expropriation Act, even though there's lots of qualification, it doesn't mean immediate expropriation of all farming land for free. What's at the back of everybody's mind is that if you have a different government to GNU, they will immediately just use that to take land in a way that they used it before. So it's a very cautious moment because of Trump, because he has definitely weakened our prospects for the people's economy with all the things he said about this country. And the one beautiful thing is that South Africans have actually stuck together, of all colors and races. They've all stuck together in their response to him. You've got very few people sort of siding openly with him, and very few people completely opposing him. But what you've got is that sort of central group who are not actually willing to separate because of what Trump is saying. And that is a very, very good sign for South Africa. And it's a very good sign that GNU will continue, that it hasn't fallen apart so far.
Yeah. And I mean, you've sort of alluded to this already, but the next question was, if you were advising the South African government today, what are 3 critical decisions would you recommend to ensure economic stability and growth? I mean, CODESA, the economic one you've sort of mentioned already. What would you say would be
the number one is the quality of infrastructure. There's only one way to get our infrastructure right in this country, and that's for the government either to privatize or to go into a much stronger alliance with the private sector to actually do the job of transporting the goods and do the job of water supply around the country, which is becoming an increasing problematic issue. It's got to be done by the people who understand, know, and actually prioritize what the best decisions are and actions to improve those are. So that's number one, is a much better relationship between GNU and the private sector on the public enterprise, improving the quality of public enterprise. The second is to have an economic CODESA, because there is no other way we can get the number of people and jobs up than to promote small businesses in this country. I did a debate with Julius Malema in 2016. It's actually on YouTube. You can watch it. Malema versus Sunter. It was at the Cape Sun. And I said, I'm as much of an economic freedom fighter as you are, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is different to yours. You want to nationalize the banks and the mines and things like that. I want to give ordinary South Africans much more economic freedom and also support them to actually become successful in using that economic freedom. So entrepreneurship is very much the second issue. And then the third issue, I would say, is that we do have to do something about still on the whole crime and corruption front, particularly violent crime and murders and things like that. And therefore, we have to do something to improve, maybe the numbers of police and the quality of police, but the quality of our legal, the legal system in this country, because that is considered by many South Africans to be the most negative flag for.
Okay. The next one comes with all the economic uncertainty, where should investors be looking to protect and grow their wealth in the coming years? That's a very open-ended question, but
well, I kind of operate on the principle. My dad, who was a stockbroker, said you should have a third of your wealth in property, a third of your wealth in stocks and shares, and a third of your wealth in bonds and money. I certainly don't have that percentage in property anymore, but I try and keep the other two suitably balanced with one another. I don't want to offer specific opinions on which country, but that's why I totally support your program of diversity, because what grows your money and allows you to make an income, which, as your one friend who said it on air just now, said, money you don't have to slog for. Over time, a fairly lowish interest rate actually doubles your capital. So I think 7% doubles your capital in 10 years and 10% doubles it in 7 years. So don't look at this specific year, just look at how that income can increase your capital before you're saying, well, I'm going to put more in the stock market because I'll make more in the stock market. Because at the moment, the stock markets are very, quite doubtful. Today has seen another fall in, a fall in European stocks, but also a fall in American stocks. That we've had a bull run post-COVID. And so, yes, you've got to have an equity participation, but that has to be offset by an exposure to property and also to bonds and obviously cash in the bank.
It's quite interesting because it sort of ties in with the next question, when are traditional assets like real estate and equity still safe bets? You kind of just answered that. or should investors be considering alternative assets in a changing landscape? And tying two questions together, because someone else asked the question earlier in the chat box. They said, in his day, his parents grew up where companies sort of owned assets. They were tangible assets, they were real fixed assets that you could touch. And now you've kind of got Bitcoin and a whole bunch of things that are intangible assets that are more kind of built on people's opinions. And he was talking about, influencers and everything in between. And so it's just interesting. I'd love to know your kind of thoughts on this kind of, it's a two-tier question, I suppose, really, because you've got alternative assets as one, and then what that other gentleman was, or lady, sorry, I'm not sure, gentleman or lady was asking around this move from real assets to kind of intangible assets,
Well, I can't give you an answer on Bitcoin. I know that Trump is pushing Bitcoin and alternative forms of Bitcoin, and they've gone up in price. But I just don't know enough about Bitcoins. There's the two scenarios. The first one is that they're for real because they're replacing paper currency, and therefore they're a good thing to hold as part of your portfolio. And the alternative is that it's like the tulips, which at some stage just dipped in value very quickly. And I simply cannot answer that question as to, what percentage might you hold in those alternative currencies. But as for the question, that companies these days are less involved in making physical things and more involved in the internet and everything like that, I agree with that, and that's why you have the Magnificent Seven companies in California. And I mean, they're worth, I don't know how many $1 trillion by themselves. And they don't produce anything. They produce a service like Amazon, and Google, and Nvidia, and all these things. So you've got to obviously have somebody who understands what's hot and what's not in the high tech sphere. But as far as the sort of physical companies are concerned, the kind of things that Trump is doing with tariffs are hideous, because a lot of the brandy that Americans consume comes from Canada. That's going to become much more expensive. A lot of the car parts of cars made in America, but they come from Canada and Mexico, and they crisscross the borders. And all this is just going to go out of the window. So there are going to be a lot of companies that are going to be physically hit by the kind of Trump tariffs. But is it more complicated than it was 50 years ago? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
It is absolutely that. My mother had a wonderful financial advisor from the kind of 80s when my dad died to when she died in 2009. And he basically grew her portfolio between 8 to 10% per annum for every year to when she died. And it was a brilliant job. He's still around in the UK. Is it more difficult to do that now? I would say yes. It's more difficult. Because
I tend to agree with you. And I think that's one of the reasons why, as an example, we've got this event on where the family office, and they come in and they talk about all the different asset classes so that you can actually understand. Because, I mean, there's a good question here. What role will AI, automation, and new technologies play in shaping economic opportunities and risks over the next decade?
Well, the one point I want to make is that, technology changing the world is not new. I've forgotten what it was called. I think it was called the Kondratiev cycle. And that was a Romanian economist who put forward at the beginning of the last century that every 60 years, technologies lead to a kind of new world. And he obviously he went back to steel, and then railways, cars, then television, then computers, now mobile phones. It would appear that every 60 years you have a new technology which has a kind of S-curve. It starts fairly slow and then it goes woof up and then it flattens out because the next technology is coming on. And with AI, we're just rounding the lower part of the S, as people find ways of making it useful in their companies. So it is a huge thing, AI, in terms of offering something new to the world. But whether it changes the world as much as mobile devices have changed the way we communicate, I mean, I just can't get over the fact that nobody in the 60s and 70s, young people, talked to each other on phones or did anything. Now it's the only thing they do.
Yeah. Tell me, what was that word? I was trying to write it down and I missed it. You said with AI, you said we've got to be careful of like almost the
Hallucinations.
or something. What did you call it?
Hallucinations.
That was it. Yeah.
H-A-L-L-I-N-A-T-I-O-N-S.
Yeah. No, I was writing down something else. I was reading the questions and I just want to write that down because I loved what you said. You know, I think the thing with AI, like most things in life, is you've got to ask the right questions. You ask the right questions, you know, you don't know what to ask, you know.
But that's what Socrates would have said. But obviously, you can still get an answer that is completely, out of court with AI because they're sort of collecting it from all the kind of sources in the world. And we all know that in the social media sphere there are plenty of false flag sources.
Yeah, no, completely. There's one here, you know, and it's probably you've probably answered it in some ways, but let me try and give it context. Where it said, looking at the key uncertainties today, what is the most realistic best case and worst case scenario for the global economy over the next 5 years?
Oh. Well, you see, I mean, if the worst case scenario for the global economy is one of those scenarios you had in that matrix, which is forked lightning. Which is that we have another global financial storm. Just like the first strike of lightning struck in after September 2007, we have another strike of lightning caused by the incredible level of government debt around the world and the fact that it won't be sort of subprime mortgages that are the problem, it'll be national debt that is the problem. And particularly, that's why everybody wants inflation to come down so that interest rates can come down, because governments do not want to have to spend a large chunk of the money they raise through taxes on servicing the debt. But now you've got these hideous levels. I've forgotten what the level of debt in Italy and Greece is, but it's absolutely monstrous. And if you start getting countries like that finding it difficult to repay the debt and then not being lent more money, things are going to become very, very difficult. And that's when the forked lightning scenario kicks in. The good scenario of new balls, please, which was all about new technologies changing the world, is obviously the scenario where AI, suddenly sends the world economy back into a kind of 3 to 5% per annum economic growth rate, because it is the new technology and lots of people will find new opportunities. And particularly in the area of green engineering because of the threat of the climate change flag. And so, you can also say, well, maybe Trump will lead to the end of the war in Ukraine much quicker than we thought. And that's when Russia and Europe may get back together again economically, which would be a good thing because Russia has a lot to offer to Europe, which it did before the invasion took place, before the annexation of Crimea, really. In fact, I remember at the beginning of the 2000s, there was a lot of talk of Russia joining the European Union because they have incredible natural resources and they also have some incredible technologies, as we've been shown in the defense industry. So the good scenario would see a quick end to the war in Ukraine with no kind of move by Putin to try and expand the war elsewhere or to maybe go back into Ukraine at a later stage. China, meanwhile, finds a way of overcoming it, the aging of its population and the fact that its population is declining, because as I said, it's probably the technological rival to America. And so there's still a lot to come out of China. So the new balls, please scenario is still on the table, but then you've got to see some of those flags turning green in order for it to take place.
Back to your conversations question, and Derek, who's chairman of one of the agricultural boards, has said, how do you organize an agri-DESA? If we wait for the government, it'll never happen. How important is it for the farmers, etc.? And I suppose it's not just a question for just the farmers, because there's the rest of us that are in power, but etc., etc. I mean, do you have any ideas or thoughts as to how we do that in terms of facilitating those conversations?
It certainly can't be me. I'm just too old to do something like that. But what should happen is that a bunch of farmers should approach our current Minister of Agriculture and say, we really do need to have this conversation so that we can actually make progress on the land reform plan, rather than just shouting at Cyril that he signed a totally unfair law and all that kind of stuff. You want some of the big farmers to say to the Minister of Agriculture, what is the best thing we can do? And as I said, one of the things that I do believe, without losing the kind of management of the farms, is you could spread the ownership, particularly of the big farms, by doing what that guy did in Nature's Valley. And the farm run by the trust next door to his own farm is actually run just as well, because it's got the same quality of management.
Yeah, yeah.
So I do feel that it's some of the principal farmers in this country, and obviously some of the principal NGOs representing the farmers, should actually put it on the table, and put it on the table publicly, so that it's not just the minister sort of quietly saying no, actually putting him under pressure to say yes, an agri-DESA would be a good idea.
Yeah. Tommy, in terms of back to your environmental outlook, and there's a question, Trump pulled out of Paris. Where do you see good places for environmental, ethical investors to put their money? She said, particularly ETFs. ETFs.
Well, I don't think because Trump has pulled out of Paris that you shouldn't invest in certain American companies, because there are a lot of companies in America producing technologies which are green, and also doing a lot of things in their supply chain to ensure that their supply chains are getting greener. So to me, it's very much on a company by company basis rather than on a country basis. And the other thing is, you've got to look at the entire life cycle of a product, because a lot of people think that electric cars are fantastic, but then you've got to renew the battery, and then you work out how much lithium has to be used in the new battery, where you actually put the old lithium, what carbon sort of emissions are sort of associated with all these kind of things that you have over the life of an electric car. So you've got to be very kind of discriminatory in your kind of thinking about what a green company is about. But there are plenty of green companies in the Scandinavian countries and in the UK and elsewhere. And yes, I know that there's a term called greenwashing, where companies sort of use their annual report to brand themselves green when they really aren't. But, that's why you've got to ask the right questions, like Socrates, and sort of pierce that kind of brand image of a country to make sure that you are investing in something that is, particularly green. And unfortunately, some companies have actually rowed back now on their green agenda because of Trump. They feel that it's no longer needed. And so they've sort of gone back to things which only augment carbon emissions. So he really has, not done a good job. But there are, with a sufficient degree of good questioning, there are plenty of American, British, European, and companies elsewhere which you can invest in because they are promoting a better planet.
So I'm conscious of your time, and there's these questions are coming in thick and fast. So I'll finish it off now. But there's a couple here that are really good. So from Jay said, I have a question regarding the scenarios. What is the best thing I can do now as an individual? Should we prepare or should we wait it out? I hope my question is clear. For example, I've adjusted my portfolio to the flags, but what else could I do?
No, that's the point, is that, you know, in a sense, you have to make decisions and you have to live with that decision. But if you see it going wrong for whatever reason, or you see a flag going the other way to what you assumed when you made that decision to have that particular mixture of assets in the portfolio, then you've got to be agile like a fox and change it. But please, I'm not in any way saying to people, oh, you've got to adjust your portfolios every day and da 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 da. I've just got to say, you know, just watch the flags and be aware of when a flag could trigger a problem with your portfolio and you should change to another country.
This is this is a great question from Kevin. He said, what skills or knowledge do you think are essential for understanding and navigating the future?
Well, you know, it's quite interesting that. I think I'm rather like Socrates. It's the ability to ask the right questions, because how I became a futurist was totally accidental. Anglo had just gone through a very bad period in the late 70s in terms of its forecasting the price of gold and diamonds and all the other stuff that we produce. So the chairman said, is there any other methodology we can use to look at the future? And our London economist, who happened to be a Belgian guy called Luc Smets, said, oh, well, there's this process called scenario planning at Shell, and the leader is about to retire from Shell, so shall I ask him to come to Johannesburg and give you a presentation at the executive? I was the secretary of the executive at the time, so Pierre arrived. Gavin Reddy said, okay, Pierre, let's hear about scenario planning. And dear old Pierre, with great sort of Gallic charm, gave his talk. He opened up by saying, do you mind if I smoke? And we thought he was going to light a Gauloise cigarette in the executive committee room, instead of which he produced 2 incense sticks and stuck them under nostrils, saying, I think more clearly about the future when I'm smoking incense. Anyway, he so bewitched the 10 directors that Gavin turned to me and said, well, Clem, as secretary, you don't mind taking on this job in addition to your normal mining responsibilities. So I said, oh, okay, Mr. Reddy. So I didn't study for it or do anything for it. I just happened to be in the room when we decided to start scenario planning. But then I did help assemble an incredible team in London around our economists in London. And I did assemble an incredible team around 2 people called Michael O'Dowd and Bobby Godsall in South Africa. And that's when the talking started. The conversations around the round table started, and they produced magnificent scenarios. And thank heavens, in the kind of early 60s, I was in a kind of, not a very good one, but a rock band in the UK, and we used to go around dead parties playing. So I knew how to entertain people. When I got all this material together, Gavin Reddy said, well, let's produce a presentation for the group companies in Anglo, which I did, and I got such a response. I then got asked by Mangasutu Buthelezi to do a presentation at one of the sessions that he'd organized in Durban. And it was like detonating a bomb. Everybody at the session rang up my secretary and said, could we hear about the high road? So I involved 2 of the team, Michael Spicer and Jim Bass. Michael Spicer was head of corporate affairs, and Jim Bass was our economist. And the 3 of us talked to about 25,000 people in 6 months around South Africa. So it's not just, you know, writing the scenarios and stuff. It's actually, you know, getting on the road and pitching them. And I say this to a lot of the scenario people today, that you write nice little articles for the Harvard Business Review or this or that or everything else. But that's not the point of scenarios. If you want to influence people's behavior, you've got to put it into simple language. You've got to find attractive names for the scenarios, and then you've got to go out there and pitch it. And that's what I did. And that was my contribution. It wasn't so much the actual research. It was the way that we pitched it to South Africa.
So the last 2 questions. Michael said, where do you see the US against the euro, the Japanese, the Chinese currency, the pound over the sort of next short to medium term?
Well, I'm one of those who still believes the dollar will remain quite strong because the US is still clearly ahead of Europe on technology and in many senses ahead of Japan too. But I wouldn't say put all your money into dollars or anything like that. I think you can have hold currencies, the pound particularly, because Trump is not imposing sanctions at the moment on the UK, because Keir Starmer is acting in an acceptable way according to Trump at the moment. But you never know, because Keir Starmer is still very pro-Ukraine and Zelensky, and at some stage Trump may find that sort of a point of division. But no, so clearly the dollar I have as a sort of primary area of external currencies. But I definitely wouldn't invest, more than 50 to 60% in that. And then I'd have a portfolio of other currencies.
Yeah. The last question is from Thomas, and he said, are there any real traction or future prospects to BRICS? As it's supposed global ideals, like, for instance, there are ideas of new currency to trade and settle global debts, etc. I suppose the question is mainly, how impactful do you think BRICS is going to be over the next couple of decades?
That's a very good question, because BRICS is, the moment, is more of a brand. They certainly don't do as much as the G20 or obviously NATO does. Well, they're not a defense pact either. But a lot of other countries have joined, which are pretty influential. And so it's seen as the kind of alternative of the Deep South to the kind of G7 countries. So, yeah, whether it develops into something that has its own currencies, that does actually come up with ways of allowing countries to borrow from each other who are within BRICS, we still got to see. I haven't seen at the moment any tangible evidence on that, but it could happen, because obviously Trump is pushing, America back into its own space, so that other countries have to find decent alternatives. So I think there is a certain pressure on BRICS to provide that alternative, because of the sort of Trump scenario of America going it alone, whereas in the past they haven't gone it alone. They've gone into, they've lent money to lots of other countries. They've done this, they've done that. But BRICS at the moment is the only alternative. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Clem, listen, I really want to thank you for your time. Just to wrap up for everyone, it always comes down to getting the right information and the right partners. So I deeply appreciate you sharing all your information, your insights, and your knowledge. I do remind people, if they want a way to take the insights, the scenarios, and the flags, I had the privilege many, many years ago of trying to figure out how to do this. So I've shared a short training with people in terms of how you can actually use it for yourself. So you've got that link. As I said, it is a unique opportunity to join us at the Wealth Weekend, which is tomorrow evening, starting at 4:00 South African time, and then Thursday and Friday. So it's virtually, it's online. You've literally got access to that family office. We will email you tomorrow with the PDF of the agenda, and you can actually see it. It's a significantly unique opportunity to be part of that conversation that Clem was talking about. If you do want to talk to a human, we always say we're a digital platform with a human heart. And so come and chat to one of our team, set up a discovery call, understand where you're at. And as I say, we're not going to sell you anything, but we can help point you in the right direction. And to conclude, I love the African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so, Clem, I deeply, deeply appreciate your time, both the presentation and taking the time to answer the Q&A. I thank you very much, from everyone at our team's perspective. And if anyone wants to, I've left the survey up. If anyone wants to fill in the survey now that you've kind of heard everything, just in terms of some useful next steps that I've given you. But yeah, Clem, from a very, very interesting world environment, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. And what I like most about what you said tonight is, firstly, like Socrates said, we've got to be able to ask the right questions. And secondly, we need to get into environments like those students that you mentioned. I think Stellenbosch, you said, where we need to create environments and communities to be able to have those conversations. And I just love the fact that you've created an environment for us to facilitate that. And I mean, just a good example of that is the Wealth University, which is free, where people can go and continue the conversation. It doesn't need to stop tonight. So I just wanted to thank you very much for being the catalyst in that.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And I'd like to say to everybody who's still on the line, may the fox be with you.
Awesome. Good night, everyone. Thanks so much. Good night, Clem.
Bye-bye.